You're very welcome back to Nationwide. Now, Donegal has some of the most spectacular landscape in the country, but they say you can't eat the landscape, and many Donegal families, one way or the other, have been affected by emigration. One man decided to write a suite of orchestral music in order to remember his grandmother and aunts who emigrated to Scotland. And the resulting piece was premiered at a sold-out concert at the National Concert Hall in Dublin recently. Our reporter Niall Martin has the story.
Damian Gallagher is driving up to Annagry in County Donegal. He's a Dublin-based composer, and over the last few years he's been writing music to help tell his family's story, a story of emigration from Donegal to Scotland.
I mean, I wouldn't say there's anything special about my story. You know, I think people of the generation of my granny, you know, they all had to leave. Most of them had to leave.
Damian has charted the lives of his granny Bella and his aunts Bridget and Sarah. All left him with happy memories of his older relatives as he was growing up. And he's brought their characters alive in 3 pieces of music premiered at a sold-out concert at the National Concert Hall. They were strong women who just each got on with it and triumphed over adversity.
Well, do you know, I thought it was a great honour that you would remember my mother in such a way. A lot of my family came from Scotland and England and all over Ireland they came down to Dublin to hear the music when it was being played. So it was really nice, and it also brought on to the next generation as well. My grandchildren, you know, really enjoyed being part of it as well. So in some ways it brought my mother alive for them.
Well, Bella was my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. She was very, very easygoing. She was a strong woman. She enjoyed the simple things in life. Really, the only things important to her were her family and being able to look after her family. And she looked after so many, not only her immediate family, but at that time her sisters came over from Ireland, and she would, you know, help set them up in Scotland. And it was all about looking after other people. She was all about looking after and making sure everyone was okay. And so in a very kind of simple way, I decided I was going to write a piece about her to kind of in memory of her and maybe depicting her story. My great auntie Sarah, who we called Big Sarah, was orphaned at 2 years of age. So obviously that had, you know, huge difficulties, and it was around the time of, there was a problem getting in and out of Ireland, you know, in those years. And for several years, none of the family that were in Scotland could come back and take Sarah and kind of rescue her from her situation. So, you know, that was difficult. But as soon as they could, she was brought over to Scotland, and, you know, she lived there then for the rest of her life.
We're now on our way to see the tiny cabin at Loch Inure, where great-aunt Sarah spent the first couple of years of her life.
It looks, for us, I suppose it looks awful. You know, it looks really tragic. But I suppose at the time, you know, in a lot of Ireland, you would have had these small one-room houses. You know, that was probably the norm for a lot of people up here. I mean, for us to look at it now, we can't imagine ever having to live in there. But, I mean, there's houses around Ireland that, you know, 10 and 12 children grew up in one room. And, you know, we can't imagine that. You know, families have kids now and they all need to have their own bedrooms. And you look in here and you wonder, God, was there 7 people living in that room, that small room that's smaller than my sitting room? Do you know, it's crazy. Hello, how are you?
Damian is still very close to his Aunt Rose and her family. Loch Inure was always his favourite place to visit growing up.
I mean, I got a lot of my inspiration for writing this piece from here. This is a scene of all my childhood memories, and it's It's my favourite place in the world. And I think because it has that nostalgia. And so a lot of times when I was composing the music, I would actually picture myself, even though I was sitting at home composing the music, I would picture myself sitting out the front here, looking down on Loch Inure Lake, and, you know, imagining almost that I was composing from here.
Damian's third piece of music is for his great-aunt Bridget. Called Gira, he's integrated lines from a 1924 song written as an ode to Gira Hill overlooking Annagry.
We're listening to Crook of Gira, a song written by my uncle John Duffy about the hill up here where the family were based, and singing it is my mother and her sister Bridget. And Damian has composed this piece, and this reflects what their life was about through the song that Uncle John had written.
It describes what it means to him to have left his country. And it actually, it's an amazing piece of poetry which describes the landscape. So it's really like a picture postcard of him standing on top of Gira Hill over there and watching out into the, you know, the different areas around Donegal, but it's a kind of like a panoramic view, and in which he describes all this area. Go up and leave the flowers, will we?
Yeah.
Today Damian has brought his nieces Kayla and Alicia to the cemetery at Annagry to see their great-grand's grave.
Look at the name. What's it say?
John Dugan.
John Dugan. And what does it say underneath that? Good
After a
girls.
lifetime living in Scotland, Damian's gran Bella made it back home in a fitting, but at the time rather dramatic way.
She came back for a family wedding, and on the morning of the wedding, unfortunately, she passed away. She was staying with us in my mum's house in Dublin, and unfortunately she passed away a couple of hours before the wedding, which was really, really difficult, obviously, on the family and on my cousin, who was the groom. It was a very, very difficult time. But I always thought, outside of that, there was a happiness to it, because she got to come back to Ireland to die, and ultimately that's what led to her being buried here. My nieces are here, and it's lovely to see my nieces, you know, maybe learning some of the music tradition, you know, from this area and you know, from my family, so that doesn't die, that you know, that the songs are kept alive. You know, my uncle wrote a song in 1924, and my sister recently has just learned how to sing that, and some of my cousins have learned how to sing that. And if they hadn't, that song would just die, be gone forever. No one would sing it anymore. And, you know, this is a way of keeping an interest and keeping the music alive of that generation, but also doing it in a very new way, a very, you know, a modern way.
Wonderful music and a very impressive project. And so we've come to the end of this evening's programme. Join us again on Monday when we begin our week of 1-hour nationwide programmes examining aspects of the 1916 Rising. And so from all of us on the nationwide team, have a great weekend. On next Monday's Nationwide, in the first of our nationwide commemorative programmes, guest presenter Brian Dobson meets the last surviving child of a leader of the 1916 Rising. Aged 102, Father Joseph Mallon recounts the story of his father Michael Mallon's life and death in 1916.